As we look at the course of Emil Kreppelin's career, we can see that he came out of a school of thinking that had become exceptionally powerful in the German lands of the 1850s. Scientists like Wilhelm Griesinger were firmly of the opinion that all diseases of the mind were diseases of the brain, and that to understand these, it was simply a matter of understanding the pathology and physiology of the brain. This was a deeply reductive view of mental illness that ran counter to the position that was being put forward by the moral therapists. But it was this school that Kraepelin was educated in. It was this school that influenced his thinking about mental illness, and it was this school that he really wanted to be a part of. But he had poor eyesight, which made the rigours of microscopy virtually impossible. He would be unable to carry out the detailed histological studies that were required of a man studying under the aegis of the likes of Paul Flechsig, a man even Edward Shorter thinks was tunnel-visioned. So to the barren pastures of alienism went Kraepelin, until he was able to return from Estonia to head up his own laboratory at the University of Heidelberg. Here he assembled an extraordinary team of the best and brightest, including Nissl and Alzheimer, and he set about redrawing the classification and understanding of mental illness. On the face of it, Kraepelin's methodology bore deep similarities to that of the pathological anatomists, except that anatomy post-mortem was the least important part of the process. Instead, he developed a card system. On admission to his clinic, each patient would be assigned a card. A description of their symptoms would be entered onto the card, and for the duration of their stay at the clinic, the progress of their disease would be noted. All the clinicians would use this method, including Alzheimer. An example of his work can be seen here. Kraepelin and his team created thousands of these cards. Once the data was compiled, it provided description of thousands of journeys through psychoses. Kraepelin analysed these journeys and used them to establish the diagnostic criteria for the two pillars of psychotic illness: manic depression, which we now call bipolar, and dementia praecox, which Eugen Bleuler rechristened schizophrenia in 1909. It was not that psychiatrists and neurologists had been unaware of the symptoms of these. Falray, for example, in France, had pretty much established the existence of manic depression, or folie de double, as he called it. There were a whole range of disease labels for conditions that would now fall under schizophrenia. These were the hebephremias and the catatonias. No, the real breakthrough was that Kraepelin established cut-and-dried diagnostic criteria combined with excellent prognosis. His method foreshadowed that would be used in the 1970s by psychiatrists like Spitzer, who were involved in redesigning the DSM along similar lines. It would be a mistake, however, to think that Kraepelin was uninterested in the biological pathology of the mental illnesses he had redescribed and redesignated. On the contrary, as Richard Knoll has shown, he was a biological psychiatrist through and through, believing in both degeneration and auto-intoxication. You don't get more biological than that. And to the hypothetical questioner who might have asked, why can't you find any lesions in the brain to correlate with your detailed symptomology? He might have replied, as many reply today, we will. Retrospectively, the story of Freud runs in a contrary direction to that of Kraepelin. Our understanding of Freudianism today is tarnished by the branding of psychoanalysis as a pseudoscience. What, people say, could be more unscientific, indeed more unbiological than Freud's theory of the unconscious? But that would be to take the anachronistic approach. In fact, Freud's theory of the neuroses, nervous diseases, was deeply biological, although it allowed for a complex interplay between the brain and the psychodynamic environment to which the human had to adapt. Freud was born an Austrian middle-class Jew, As you can see from this slide, he was educated at the University of Vienna, where he enrolled to do biology and medicine, and it would take him the best part of 8 years to qualify as a doctor. But this was because he became sidetracked by neurology and undertaking research in that discipline. In particular, his work for Theodor Meiner, whose quote here indicates just how biologically reductive his psychiatric vision was, delayed his graduation. However, the real turning point came for Freud when he got a scholarship to go and study for a few months at the Salpêtrière under Charcot. It was here that he first started grappling with the causes of hysteria. Freud became determined to make this his field. When he returned to Vienna, he started working with a like-minded physician, Joseph Breuer, who specialised in the treatment of middle-class hysterical women. The case of Anna O was to become the foundational text for the therapy of psychoanalysis. Bertha Pappenheim had lost her ability to speak and had become partially paralysed. There was no functional cause for this, so hysteria was diagnosed. Breuer used hypnotism to uncover a trauma in Bertha's past that was the trigger for the neuroses, and having recovered this repressed event, was able to cure Bertha. Her symptoms appeared to vanish. Here is not the place to explore the gaps and omissions in this story. In reality, Bertha was far from cured, but Freud was impressed enough to develop his reasoning about the unconscious and hysteria. He would have learnt from Charcot that trauma was often the origin of hysteria, and he then decided that the trauma a lot of his patients, young middle-class women, were suffering from was sexual abuse as children. He gained his evidence for what he called his seduction theory through his technique. Freud was no good at hypnotism, so he had to explore other methods of entering the realms of the subconscious. One of these was to analyse the dreams and memories of his patients, which often involved the recollection of abuse by adults. But in 1897 he abandoned the theory. On the practical level, there was the issue of what respectable family would send their daughters to a man who would then reveal that they'd been abused. But the likelihood is really that Freud became aware that the therapeutic encounter was eliciting, even constructing, both trauma and fantasy from the patients. Having abandoned the seduction theory, he developed a new model of the mind with a new theory as to how people became hysterical or neurotic. It was a tripartite model, with mind consisting of 3 elements. The id, which represented the animal drives of each individual, their inner Mr. Hyde, if you like, their evolutionary inheritance. The ego represented the inherent rationality of the human being, the ultimate pinnacle of the evolutionary process. And between the two was a negotiator, the superego, who tried to resolve the conflicts between animal desires and civilized rationality. And I must emphasize it was fundamentally Darwinian. We can see this clearly in one of the foundational concepts of Freudianism, the Oedipus complex. The story of Oedipus is well known, but to skim through it, King Laius of Thebes received a warning from an oracle that he would be murdered by his son, who would then go on to marry Laius's wife Jocasta. So when they had a son, Laius sent him away, chained him to the mountainside with a stake through his foot, hoping he would be devoured by a wild beast, or failing that, starved to death. The plan was foiled by a shepherd who rescued Oedipus and brought him up as his own son. Once grown up, Oedipus, knowing nothing of his origins, set out for Thebes. On the way he got into an argument with a charioteer, which turned violent. He killed the charioteer, who happened to be his father Laius. Arriving in Thebes, he then craftily defeated the Sphinx, who had been enslaving the Thebans, and was made king for his efforts, whereupon he was married, as a matter of course, to Jocasta, his mother. The prophecy had become true. Thebes, however, suffers the wrath of the gods, and Tiresias reveals the origin of Thebes' misfortune. Jocasta kills herself, and Oedipus, in horror, blinds himself and goes into exile. Now, in adopting this story, Freud wasn't saying that the ancient Greeks invented the complex. Far from it. Rather, he was saying that the Greeks themselves had a subconscious understanding of what the Oedipal myth represented. It was something deeply ingrained in the biological inheritance of humanity. It was a stage experienced by all male children, a desire to kill one's father and sleep with one's mother. A failure to negotiate this stage, or its female equivalent, the Cassandra complex, would result in maladaptation and neuroses. So here they are, the different stages, each to be negotiated without trauma and with understanding what's going on and all of that. Failure to go through these stages resulted in problems that were often inherent to civilization. We won't explore here the actual therapy, psychoanalysis. That is a subject for later on. Rather, we need to understand that, in its way, this was just another form of biological psychiatry. Some of you will be familiar with the Cotton Affair. If you aren't, it's well worth reading Andrew Scull's account of what Cotton got up to at Trenton, New Jersey, after he'd been appointed superintendent there. Treated as an aberration by Edward Shorter, Scull attempted to reposition Cotton within the mainstream of psychiatry. As we will see, this was a very reasonable argument, because for all the horror of the Trenton case, Cotton was working within the paradigm, not against it. Basically, he was a believer in auto-intoxication, just like Kreppelin. This was the idea that hidden pockets of infection, focal sepsis, could result in poison being sent through the body and into the brain, causing madness. Cotton was appointed to Trenton in 1907 as a new broom to sweep away the old order. He'd been trained at the best school for psychiatrists under Adolf Meyer, the doyen of American psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. He'd travelled overseas to witness the work of Kreppelin and his team at Heidelberg. On his return, he works at Worcester, which was the best laboratory of any asylum in the USA. He was dedicated to the idea that by using laboratory science, the evils of madness could be extirpated. For Cotton, auto-intoxication was the cause of all madness, which on one level was about as biologically reductive as you could get. At the same time, it allowed considerably less room for degeneration. Focal sepsis, it seems, did not discriminate between the rich or the poor, or the genetically fit or unfit. In retrospect, it was a pretty bad idea, especially as the treatment that flowed from it was all too logical. The removal of teeth, tonsils, the colon resected, the stomach being a real harbour of hidden infection. Even testes and ovaries removed. The more invasive practices came with the high price of post-operative infection, still rife in the pre-antibiotic era. People died. But worst of all, he rorted the figures. His claims of outstandingly high rates of cure were exaggerated beyond belief, and the reality was his cure was no cure at all. By Cotton's death in the early 1930s, auto-intoxication had had its day and was consigned to the dust heap of psychiatric history, consisting of those well-intentioned but ultimately dangerous speculations that appear to have plagued the practice. In the final module, we return to the interplay of trauma, biology and the nerves with a study of shell shock.